The old man returned to his work, and I strolled on down the path between the espaliers, gnarled and gouty with age, thinking of the story I had heard, and groping for the point in it that had some key to my memory. In an instant it came before me. I had seen the phrase "Grey Hills" on the slip of yellowed paper that Professor Gregg had taken from the drawer in his cabinet. Again I was seized with pangs of mingled curiosity and fear. I remembered the strange characters copied from the limestone rock, and then again their identity with the inscription of the age-old seal and the fantastic fables of the Latin geographer. I saw beyond doubt that, unless coincidence had set all the scene and disposed all these bizarre events with curious art, I was to be a spectator of things far removed from the usual and customary traffic and jostle of life. Professor Gregg I noted day by day. He was hot on his trail, growing lean with eagerness, and in the evenings, when the sun was swimming on the verge of the mountain, he would pace the terrace to and fro, with his eyes on the ground, while the mist grew white in the valley, and the stillness of the evening brought far voices near, and the blue smoke rose a straight column from the diamond-shaped chimney of the grey farmhouse, just as I had seen it on the first morning. I have told you I was of sceptical habit, but though I understood little or nothing, I began to dread, vainly proposing to myself the iterated dogmas of science that all life is material, and that in the system of things there is no undiscovered land, even beyond the remotest stars, where the supernatural can find a footing. Yet there struck in on this the thought that matter is really as awful and unknown as spirit, that science itself but dallies on the threshold, scarcely gaining more than a glimpse of the wonders of the inner place. There is one day that stands up from amidst the others as a grim red beacon betokening evil to come. I was sitting on a bench in the garden, watching the boy Craddock weeding, when I was suddenly alarmed by a harsh and choking sound, like the cry of a wild beast in anguish, and I was unspeakably shocked to see the unfortunate lad standing in full view before me, his whole body quivering and shaking at short intervals, as though shocks of electricity were passing through him, his teeth grinding, foam gathering on his lips, and his face all swollen and blackened to a hideous mask of humanity. I shrieked with terror, and Professor Gregg came running, and as I pointed to Craddock, the boy with one convulsive shudder fell face forward, and lay on the wet earth, his body writhing like a wounded blind worm, and an inconceivable babble of sounds bursting and rattling and hissing from his lips. He seemed to pour forth an infamous jargon with words, or what seemed words, that might have belonged to a tongue dead since untold ages and buried beneath Nilotic mud, or in the inmost recesses of the Mexican forest. For a moment the thought passed through my mind, as my ears were still revolted with that infernal clamour, surely this is the very speech of hell. And then I cried out again and again, and ran away shuddering to my inmost soul. I had seen Professor Gregg's face as he stooped over the wretched boy and raised him, and I was appalled by the glow of exultation that shone on every lineament and feature. As I sat in my room with drawn blinds and my eyes hidden in my hands, I heard heavy steps beneath, and I was told afterwards that Professor Gregg had carried Craddock to his study and had locked the door. I heard voices murmur indistinctly, and I trembled to think of what might be passing within a few feet of where I sat. I longed to escape to the woods and sunshine, and yet I dreaded the sights that might confront me on the way. And at last, as I held the handle of the door nervously, I heard Professor Gregg's voice calling to me with a cheerful ring. "It's all right now, Miss Lally," he said. "The poor fellow has got over it, and I have been arranging for him to sleep here after tomorrow. Perhaps I may be able to do something for him. Yes," he said later, "it was a very painful sight, and I don't wonder you were alarmed. We may hope that good food will build him up a little, but I am afraid he will never be really cured.' And he affected the dismal and conventional air with which one speaks of hopeless illness, and yet beneath it I detected the delight that leapt up rampant within him, and fought and struggled to find utterance. It was as if one glanced down on the even surface of the sea, clear and immobile, and saw beneath raging depths and a storm of contending billows. It was indeed to me a torturing and offensive problem that this man, who had so bounteously rescued me from the sharpness of death, and showed himself in all the relations of life full of benevolence and pity and kindly forethought, should so manifestly be for once on the side of the demons, and take a ghastly pleasure in the torments of an afflicted fellow creature. Apart I struggled with the horned difficulty, and strove to find the solution, but without the hint of a clue, beset by mystery and contradiction. I saw nothing that might help me, and began to wonder whether, after all, I had not escaped from the white mist of the suburb at too dear a rate. I hinted something of my thought to the professor. I said enough to let him know that I was in the most acute perplexity, but the moment after regretted what I had done, when I saw his face contort with a spasm of pain. 'My dear Miss Lally,' he said, 'you surely do not wish to leave us? No, no, you would not do it. You do not know how I rely on you, how confidently I go forward, assured that you are here to watch over my children. You, Miss Lally, are my rear guard, for let me tell you the business in which I am engaged is not wholly devoid of peril. You have not forgotten what I said the first morning here. My lips are shut by an old and firm resolve, till they can open to utter no ingenious hypothesis or vague surmise, but irrefragable fact, as certain as a demonstration in mathematics. Think it over, Miss Lally. Not for a moment would I endeavour to keep you here against your own instincts, and yet I tell you frankly that I am persuaded it is here, amidst the woods, that your duty lies.' I was touched by the eloquence of his tone, and by the remembrance that the man, after all, had been my salvation, and I gave him my hand on a promise to serve him loyally and without question. A few days later the rector of our church, a little church grey and severe and quaint, that hovered on the very banks of the river, and watched the tides swim and return, came to see us, and Professor Gregg easily persuaded him to stay and share our dinner. Mr. Merrick was a member of an antique family of squires, whose old manor house stood amongst the hills some 7 miles away, and thus rooted in the soil, the rector was a living store of all the old fading customs and lore of the country. His manner, genial with a deal of retired oddity, won on Professor Gregg, and towards the cheese, when a curious Burgundy had begun its incantations, the two men glowed like the wine, and talked of philology with the enthusiasm of a burgess over the peerage. The parson was expounding the pronunciation of the Welsh double L, and producing sounds like the gurgle of his native brooks, when Professor Gregg struck in. 'By the way,' he said, 'that was a very odd word I met with the other day. You know my boy, poor Gervase Cradock? Well, he has got the bad habit of talking to himself, and the day before yesterday I was walking in the garden here and heard him. He was evidently quite unconscious of my presence. A lot of what he said I couldn't make out, but one word struck me distinctly. It was such an odd sound, half sibilant, half guttural, and as quaint as those double L's you have been demonstrating. I do not know whether I can give you an idea of the sound. Ishakshar is perhaps as near as I can get, but the K ought to be a Greek chi or a Spanish jota. Now what does it mean in Welsh?' 'In Welsh?' said the parson. 'There is no such word in Welsh, nor any word remotely resembling it.' I know the book Welsh, as they call it, and the colloquial dialects as well as any man, but there's no word like that from Anglesey to Usk. Besides, none of the Cradocks speak a word of Welsh. It's dying out here.' 'Really, you interest me extremely, Mr. Merrick. I confess the word didn't strike me as having a Welsh ring, but I thought it might be some local corruption. No, I never heard such a word or anything like it. Indeed,' he added, smiling whimsically, 'if it belongs to any language, I should say it must be that of the fairies, the Tylwyth Teg, as we call them.' The talk went on to the discovery of a Roman villa in the neighbourhood, and soon after I left the room, and sat down apart to wonder at the drawing together of such strange clues of evidence. As the professor had spoken of the curious word, I had caught the glint in his eye upon me, and though the pronunciation he gave was grotesque in the extreme, I recognized the name of the stone of 60 characters mentioned by Solinus, the black seal shut up in some secret drawer of the study, stamped forever by a vanished race with signs that no man could read, signs that might, for all I knew, be the veils of awful things done long ago and forgotten before the hills were moulded into form. When the next morning I came down, I found Professor Gregg pacing the terrace in his eternal walk. 'Look at that bridge,' he said, when he saw me. 'Observe the quaint and Gothic design, the angles between the arches, and the silvery grey of the stone in the awe of the morning light. I confess it seems to me symbolic. It should illustrate a mystical allegory of the passage from one world to another.' 'Professor Gregg,' I said quietly, 'it is time that I knew something of what has happened, and of what is to happen.' For the moment he put me off, but I returned again with the same question in the evening, and then Professor Gregg flamed with excitement. 'Don't you understand yet?' he cried. 'But I have told you a good deal, yes, and shown you a good deal. You have heard pretty nearly all that I have heard, and seen what I have seen, or at least,' and his voice chilled as he spoke, 'enough to make a good deal clear as noonday. The servants told you, I have no doubt, that the wretched boy Cradock had another seizure the night before last. He awoke me with cries in that voice you heard in the garden, and I went to him, and God forbid you should see what I saw that night. But all this is useless. My time here is drawing to a close. I must be back in town in 3 weeks, as I have a course of lectures to prepare, and need all my books about me. In a very few days it will be all over, and I shall no longer hint, and no longer be liable to ridicule as a madman and a quack. No, I shall speak plainly, and I shall be heard with such emotions as perhaps no other man has ever drawn from the breasts of his fellows.' He paused, and seemed to grow radiant with the joy of great and wonderful discovery. 'But all that is for the future, the near future certainly, but still the future,' he went on at length. 'There is something to be done yet. You will remember my telling you that my researches were not altogether devoid of peril? Yes, there is a certain amount of danger to be faced. I did not know how much when I spoke on the subject before, and to a certain extent I am still in the dark. But it will be strange adventure, the last of all, the last demonstration in the chain.' He was walking up and down the room as he spoke, and I could hear in his voice the contending tones of exultation and despondence, or perhaps I should say awe, the awe of a man who goes forth on unknown waters, and I thought of his allusions to Columbus on the night he had laid his book before me. The evening was a little chilly, and a fire of logs had been lighted in the study where we were. The remittent flame and the glow on the walls reminded me of the old days. I was sitting silent in an armchair by the fire, wondering over all I had heard, and still vainly speculating as to the secret springs concealed from me under all the phantasmagoria I had witnessed, when I became suddenly aware of a sensation that change of some sort had been at work in the room. and that there was something unfamiliar in its aspect. For some time I looked about me, trying in vain to localize the alteration that I knew had been made. The table by the window, the chairs, the faded settee, were all as I had known them. Suddenly, as a sought-for recollection flashes into the mind, I knew what was amiss. I was facing the professor's desk, which stood on the other side of the fire, and above the desk was a grimy-looking bust of Pitt that I had never seen there before. And then I remembered the true position of this work of art. In the furthest corner, by the door, was an old cupboard projecting into the room, and on top of the cupboard, 15 feet from the floor, the bust had been, and there, no doubt, it had delayed accumulating dirt since the early days of the century. I was utterly amazed, and sat silent still in a confusion of thought. There was, so far as I knew, no such thing as a step-ladder in the house, for I had asked for one to make some alterations in the curtains of my room, and a tall man standing on a chair would have found it impossible to take down the bust. It had been placed not on the edge of the cupboard, but far back against the wall, and Professor Gregg was, if anything, under the average height. "How on earth did you manage to get down Pitt?" I said at last. The professor looked curiously at me, and seemed to hesitate a little. "They must have found you a step-ladder, or perhaps the gardener brought in a short ladder from outside?" "No, I had no ladder of any kind. Now, Miss Lally," he went on with an awkward simulation of jest, "there is a little puzzle for you, a problem in the manner of the inimitable Holmes. There are the facts, plain and patent. Summon your acuteness to the solution of the puzzle. For heaven's sake," he cried with a breaking voice, "say no more about it. I tell you, I never touched the thing." And he went out of the room with horror manifest on his face, and his hand shook and jarred the door behind him. I looked round the room in vague surprise, not at all realizing what had happened, making vain and idle surmises by way of explanation, and wondering at the stirring of black waters by an idle word and the trivial change of an ornament. This is some petty business, some whim on which I have jarred, I reflected. The professor is perhaps scrupulous and superstitious over trifles, and my question may have outraged unacknowledged fears, as though one killed a spider or spilled the salt before the very eyes of a practical Scotchwoman. I was immersed in these fond suspicions, and began to plume myself a little on my immunity from such empty fears, when the truth fell heavily as lead upon my heart, and I recognized with cold terror that some awful influence had been at work. The bust was simply inaccessible. Without a ladder, no one could have touched it. I went out to the kitchen, and spoke as quietly as I could to the housemaid. "Who moved that bust from the top of the cupboard, Anne?" I said to her. "Professor Gregg says he has not touched it. Did you find an old step-ladder in one of the outhouses?" The girl looked at me blankly. "I never touched it," she said. "I found it where it is now the other morning, when I dusted the room. I remember now, it was Wednesday morning, because it was the morning after Cradock was taken bad in the night. My room is next to his, you know, miss," the girl went on piteously, "and it was awful to hear how he cried and called out names that I couldn't understand. It made me feel all afraid. And then master came, and I heard him speak, and he took down Cradock to the study and gave him something." "And you found that bust moved the next morning?" "Yes, miss. There was a queer sort of smell in the study when I came down and opened the windows. A bad smell it was, and I wondered what it could be. Do you know, miss, I went a long time ago to the Zoo in London with my cousin Thomas Barker, one afternoon that I had off, when I was at Mrs Prince's in Stanhope Gate, and we went into the snake house to see the snakes, and it was just the same sort of smell. Very sick it made me feel, I remember, and I got Barker to take me out, and it was just the same kind of smell in the study as I was saying, and I was wondering what it could be from, when I see that bust with Pitt cut in it, standing on the master's desk, and I thought to myself, now who has done that, and how have they done it? And when I came to dust the things, I looked at the bust, and I saw a great mark on it where the dust was gone, for I don't think it can have been touched with a duster for years and years, and it wasn't like finger marks, but a large patch, like, broad and spread out. So I passed my hand over it, without thinking what I was doing, and where that patch was, it was all sticky and slimy, as if a snail had crawled over it. Very strange, isn't it, miss? And I wonder who can have done it, and how that mess was made.' The well-meant gabble of the servant touched me to the quick. I lay down upon my bed and bit my lip that I should not cry out loud in the sharp anguish of my terror and bewilderment. Indeed, I was almost mad with dread. I believe that if it had been daylight, I should have fled hot foot, forgetting all courage and all the debt of gratitude that was due to Professor Gregg, not caring whether my fate were that I must starve slowly, so long as I might escape from the net of blind and panic fear that every day seemed to draw a little closer round me. If I knew, I thought, if I knew what there was to dread, I could guard against it. But here, in this lonely house, shut in on all sides by the olden woods and the vaulted hills, terror seems to spring inconsequent from every covert, and the flesh is aghast at the half-hearted murmurs of horrible things. All in vain I strove to summon scepticism to my aid, and endeavoured by cool common sense to buttress my belief in a world of natural order. For the air that blew in at the open window was a mystic breath, and in the darkness I felt the silence go heavy and sorrowful as a mass of requiem, and I conjured images of strange shapes gathering fast amidst the reeds beside the wash of the river. In the morning, from the moment that I set foot in the breakfast room, I felt that the unknown plot was drawing to a crisis. The professor's face was firm and set, and he seemed hardly to hear our voices when we spoke. 'I am going out for a rather long walk,' he said, when the meal was over. 'You mustn't be expecting me now, or thinking anything has happened if I don't turn up to dinner. I have been getting stupid lately, and I dare say a miniature walking tour will do me good. Perhaps I may even spend the night in some little inn, if I find any place that looks clean and comfortable.' I heard this, and I knew by my experience of Professor Gregg's manner that it was no ordinary business of pleasure that impelled him. I knew not, nor even remotely guessed, where he was bound, nor had I the vaguest notion of his errand. But all the fear of the night before returned, and as he stood smiling on the terrace, ready to set out, I implored him to stay, and to forget all his dreams of the undiscovered continent. 'No, no, Miss Lally,' he replied, still smiling. 'It's too late now. Vestigia nulla retrorsum, you know, is the device of all true explorers, though I hope it won't be literally true in my case. But indeed you are wrong to alarm yourself so. I look upon my little expedition as quite commonplace, no more exciting than a day with the geological hammers. There is a risk, of course, but so there is on the commonest excursion. I can afford to be jaunty. I am doing nothing so hazardous as 'Arry does 100 times over in the course of every bank holiday. Well then, you must look more cheerfully, and so goodbye till tomorrow at latest.' He walked briskly up the road, and I saw him open the gate that marks the entrance of the wood, and then he vanished in the gloom of the trees. All the day passed heavily, with a strange darkness in the air, and again I felt as if imprisoned amidst the ancient woods, shut in an olden land of mystery and dread, and as if all was long ago, and forgotten by the living outside. I hoped and dreaded, and when the dinner hour came I waited, expecting to hear the professor's step in the hall, and his voice exulting at I knew not what triumph. I composed my face to welcome him gladly, but the night descended dark, and he did not come. In the morning, when the maid knocked at my door, I called out to her, and asked if her master had returned, and when she replied that his bedroom door stood open and empty, I felt the cold clasp of despair. Still I fancied he might have discovered genial company, and would return for luncheon, or perhaps in the afternoon, and I took the children for a walk in the forest, and tried my best to play and laugh with them, and to shout out the thoughts of mystery and veiled terror. Hour after hour I waited, and my thoughts grew darker. Again the night came, and found me watching, and at last, as I was making much ado to finish my dinner, I heard steps outside, and the sound of a man's voice. The maid came in and looked oddly at me. "Please, miss," she began, "Mr. Morgan, the gardener, wants to speak to you for a minute, if you didn't mind." "Show him in, please," I answered, and set my lips tight. The old man came slowly into the room, and the servant shut the door behind him. "Sit down, Mr. Morgan," I said. "What is it that you want to say to me?" "Well, miss, Mr. Gregg, he gave me something for you yesterday morning, just before he went off, and he told me particular not to hand it up before 8 o'clock this evening exactly, if so be he wasn't back again home before, and he should come home before I was just to return it to him in his own hands. So you see, as Mr. Gregg isn't here yet, I suppose I'd better give you the parcel directly." He pulled out something from his pocket and gave it to me, half rising. I took it silently, and seeing that Morgan seemed doubtful as to what he was to do next, I thanked him and bade him good night, and he went out. I was left alone in the room with a parcel in my hand, a paper parcel, neatly sealed and directed to me, with the instructions Morgan had quoted, all written in the professor's large, loose hand. I broke the seals with a choking at my heart, and found an envelope inside, addressed also, but open, and I took the letter out. "My dear Miss Lally," it began, "to quote the old logic manual, the case of your reading this note is a case of my having made a blunder of some sort. And I am afraid a blunder that turns these lines into a farewell. It is practically certain that neither you nor anyone else will ever see me again. I have made my will with provision for this eventuality, and I hope you will consent to accept the small remembrance addressed to you, and my sincere thanks for the way in which you joined your fortunes to mine. The fate which has come upon me is desperate and terrible beyond the remotest dreams of man, but this fate you have a right to know, if you please. If you look in the left-hand drawer of my dressing table, you will find the key of the escritoire properly labelled. In the well of the escritoire is a large envelope sealed and addressed to your name. I advise you to throw it forthwith into the fire. You will sleep better of nights if you do so. But if you must know the history of what has happened, it is all written down for you to read." The signature was firmly written below, and again I turned the page and read out the words, one by one, aghast and white to the lips, my hands cold as ice, and sickness choking me. The dead silence of the room, and the thought of the dark woods and hills closing me in on every side, oppressed me, helpless and without capacity, and not knowing where to turn for counsel. At last I resolved that, though knowledge should haunt my whole life and all the days to come, I must know the meaning of the strange terrors that had so long tormented me, rising grey, dim, and awful, like the shadows in the wood at dusk. I carefully carried out Professor Gregg's directions, and not without reluctance broke the seal of the envelope, and spread out his manuscript before me. That manuscript I always carry with me, and I see that I cannot deny your unspoken request to read it. This, then, was what I read that night, sitting at the desk with a shaded lamp beside me.' The young lady, who called herself Miss Lally, then proceeded to recite: 'The statement of William Gregg, F.R.S., etc. It is many years since the first glimmer of the theory which is now almost, if not quite, reduced to fact, dawned on my mind. A somewhat extensive course of miscellaneous and obsolete reading had done a great deal to prepare the way, and later, when I became somewhat of a specialist and immersed myself in the studies known as ethnological, I was now and then startled by facts that would not square with orthodox scientific opinion, and by discoveries that seemed to hint at something still hidden for all our research. More particularly, I became convinced that much of the folklore of the world is but an exaggerated account of events that really happened, and I was especially drawn to consider the stories of the fairies, the good folk of the Celtic races. Here I thought I could detect the fringe of embroidery and exaggeration, the fantastic guise, the little people dressed in green and gold, sporting in the flowers, and I thought I saw a distinct analogy between the name given to this race, supposed to be imaginary, and the description of their appearance and manners, just as our remote ancestors called the dreaded beings fair and good precisely because they dreaded them. So they had dressed them up in charming forms, knowing the truth to be the very reverse. Literature, too, had gone early to work, and had lent a powerful hand in the transformation, so that the playful elves of Shakespeare are already far removed from the true original, and the real horror is disguised in a form of prankish mischief. But in the older tales, the stories that used to make men cross themselves as they sat around the burning logs, we tread a different stage. I saw a widely opposed spirit in certain histories of children and of men and women who vanished strangely from the earth. They would be seen by a peasant in the fields walking towards some green and rounded hillock, and seen no more on earth. And there are stories of mothers who have left a child quietly sleeping, with a cottage door rudely barred with a piece of wood, and have returned, not to find the plump and rosy little Saxon, but a thin, wizened creature, with sallow skin and black, piercing eyes, the child of another race. Then again, there were myths darker still, the dread of witch and wizard, the lurid evil of the Sabbath, and the hint of demons who mingled with the daughters of men. And just as we have turned the terrible fair folk into a company of benignant, if freakish, elves, so we have hidden from us the black foulness of the witch and her companions under a popular diablerie of old women and broomsticks and a comic cat with tail on end. So the Greeks called the hideous Furies benevolent ladies, and thus the northern nations have followed their example. I pursued my investigations, stealing odd hours from other and more imperative labours, and I asked myself the question, supposing these traditions to be true, who were the demons who are reported to have attended the Sabbaths? I need not say that I laid aside what I may call the supernatural hypothesis of the Middle Ages, and came to the conclusion that fairies and devils were of one and the same race and origin. Invention, no doubt, and the Gothic fancy of old days had done much in the way of exaggeration and distortion, yet I firmly believe that beneath all this imagery there was a black background of truth. As for some of the alleged wonders, I hesitated. While I should be very loath to receive any one specific instance of modern spiritualism as containing even a grain of the genuine, yet I was not wholly prepared to deny that human flesh may now and then, once perhaps in 10 million cases, be the veil of powers which seem magical to us, powers which, so far from proceeding from the heights and leading men thither, are in reality survivals from the depths of being. The amoeba and the snail have powers which we do not possess, and I thought it possible that the theory of reversion might explain many things which seem wholly inexplicable. Thus stood my position. I saw good reason to believe that much of the tradition, a vast deal of the earliest and uncorrupted tradition of the so-called fairies, represented solid fact, and I thought that the purely supernatural element in these traditions was to be accounted for on the hypothesis that a race which had fallen out of the grand march of evolution might have retained as a survival certain powers which would be to us wholly miraculous. Such was my theory as it stood conceived in my mind, and working with this in view, I seemed to gather confirmation from every side, from the spoils of a tumulus or a barrow, from a local paper reporting an antiquarian meeting in the country, and from general literature of all kinds. Among other instances, I remember being struck by the phrase articulate speaking men in Homer, as if the writer knew or had heard of men whose speech was so rude that it could hardly be termed articulate. And on my hypothesis of a race who had lagged far behind the rest, I could easily conceive that such a folk would speak a jargon but little removed from the inarticulate noises of brute beasts. Thus I stood satisfied that my conjecture was at all events not far removed from fact, when a chance paragraph in a small country print one day arrested my attention. It was a short account of what was to all appearance the usual sordid tragedy of the village: a young girl unaccountably missing, and evil rumour blatant and busy with her reputation. Yet I could read between the lines that all this scandal was purely hypothetical, and in all probability invented to account for what was in any other manner unaccountable. A flight to London or Liverpool, or an undiscovered body lying with a weight about its neck in the foul depths of a woodland pool, or perhaps murder — such were the theories of the wretched girl's neighbours. But as I idly scanned the paragraph, a flash of thought passed through me with the violence of an electric shock. What if the obscure and horrible race of the hills still survived, still remained haunting wild places and barren hills, and now and then repeating the evil of Gothic legend, unchanged and unchangeable as the Turanian Shelta or the Basques of Spain? I have said that the thought came with violence, and indeed I drew in my breath sharply, and clung with both hands to my elbow chair, in a strange confusion of horror and elation. It was as if one of my confreres of physical science, roaming in a quiet English wood, had been suddenly stricken aghast by the presence of the slimy and loathsome terror of the Ichthyosaurus, the original of the stories of the awful worms killed by valorous knights, or had seen the sun darkened by the pterodactyl, the dragon of tradition. Yet, as a resolute explorer of knowledge, the thought of such a discovery threw me into a passion of joy, and I cut out the slip from the paper and put it in a drawer in my old bureau, resolved that it should be but the first piece in a collection of the strangest significance. I sat long that evening, dreaming of the conclusions I should establish, nor did cooler reflection at first dash my confidence. Yet, as I began to put the case fairly, I saw that I might be building on an unstable foundation. The facts might possibly be in accordance with local opinion, and I regarded the affair with a mood of some reserve. Yet I resolved to remain perched on the lookout, and I hugged to myself the thought that I alone was watching and wakeful, while the great crowd of thinkers and searchers stood heedless and indifferent, perhaps letting the most prerogative facts pass by unnoticed. Several years elapsed before I was enabled to add to the contents of the drawer, and the second find was in reality not a valuable one, for it was a mere repetition of the first, with only the variation of another and distant locality. Yet I gained something, for in the second case, as in the first, the tragedy took place in a desolate and lonely country, and so far my theory seemed justified. But the third piece was to me far more decisive. Again, among outland hills, far even from a main road of traffic, an old man was found done to death, and the instrument of execution was left beside him. Here indeed there were rumour and conjecture, for the deadly tool was a primitive stone axe, bound by gut to the wooden handle, and surmises the most extravagant and improbable were indulged in. Yet, as I thought with a kind of glee, the wildest conjectures went far astray, and I took the pains to enter into correspondence with the local doctor, who was called at the inquest. He, a man of some acuteness, was dumbfounded. "It will not do to speak of these things in country places," he wrote to me, "but frankly there is some hideous mystery here. I have obtained possession of the stone axe, and have been curious as to test its powers. I took it into the backyard of my house one Sunday afternoon, when my family and the servants were all out, and there, sheltered by the poplar hedges, I made my experiments. I found the thing utterly unmanageable. Whether there is some peculiar balance, some nice adjustment of weights, which require incessant practice, or whether an effectual blow can be struck only by a certain trick of the muscles, I do not know, but I can assure you that I went into the house with but a sorry opinion of my athletic capacities. I was like an inexperienced man putting the hammer. The force exerted seemed to return on oneself, and I found myself hurled backwards with violence, while the axe fell harmless to the ground. On another occasion I tried the experiment with a clever woodman of the place, but this man, who had handled his axe for 40 years, could do nothing with the stone implement, and missed every stroke most ludicrously. In short, if it were not so supremely absurd, I should say that for 4,000 years no one on earth could have struck an effective blow with the tool that undoubtedly was used to murder the old man. This, as may be imagined, was to me rare news, and afterwards, when I heard the whole story and learned that the unfortunate old man had babbled tales of what might be seen at night on a certain wild hillside, hinting at unheard of wonders, and that he had been found cold one morning on the very hill in question, my exultation was extreme, for I felt I was leaving conjecture far behind me. But the next step was of still greater importance. I had possessed for many years an extraordinary stone seal, a piece of dull black stone 2 inches long from the handle to the stamp, and the stamping end a rough hexagon 1.25 inches in diameter. Altogether, it presented the appearance of an enlarged tobacco stopper of an old-fashioned make. It had been sent to me by an agent of the East, who informed me that it had been found near the site of the ancient Babylon. But the characters engraved on the seal were to me an intolerable puzzle. Somewhat of the cuneiform pattern, there were yet striking differences, which I detected at the first glance, and all efforts to read the inscription on the hypothesis that the rules for deciphering the arrow-headed writing would apply proved futile. A riddle such as this stung my pride, and at odd moments I would take the black seal out of the cabinet and scrutinize it with so much idle perseverance that every letter was familiar to my mind, and I could have drawn the inscription from memory without the slightest error. Judge then of my surprise when I one day received from a correspondent in the west of England a letter and an enclosure that positively left me thunderstruck. I saw carefully traced on the large piece of paper the very characters of the black seal, without alteration of any kind, and above the inscription my friend had written, "Inscription found on a limestone rock on the Grey Hills, Monmouthshire, done in some red earth, and quite recent." I turned to the letter. My friend wrote, "I send you the enclosed inscription with all due reserve. A shepherd who passed by the stone a week ago swears that there was then no mark of any kind. The characters, as I have noted, are formed by drawing some red earth over the stone, and are of an average height of 1 inch. They look to me like a kind of cuneiform character, a good deal altered. But this, of course, is impossible. It may be either a hoax, or more probably some scribble of the gipsies, who are plentiful enough in this wild country. They have, as you are aware, many hieroglyphics which they use in communicating with one another. I happened to visit the stone in question 2 days ago, in connection with a rather painful incident which has occurred here. As it may be supposed, I wrote immediately to my friend, thanking him for the copy of the inscription, and asking him in a casual manner the history of the incident he mentioned. To be brief, I heard that a woman named Craddock, who had lost her husband a day before, had set out to communicate the sad news to a cousin who lived some 5 miles away. She took a short cut, which led by the Grey Hills. Mrs. Craddock, who was then quite a young woman, never arrived at her relative's house. Late that night, a farmer, who had lost a couple of sheep supposed to have wandered from the flock, was walking over the Grey Hills with a lantern and his dog. His attention was attracted by a noise which he described as a kind of wailing, mournful and pitiable to hear, and guided by the sound he found the unfortunate Mrs. Craddock crouched on the ground by the limestone rock, swaying her body to and fro, and lamenting and crying in so heartrending a manner that the farmer was, as he says, at first obliged to stop his ears, or he would have run away. The woman allowed herself to be taken home, and a neighbour came to see to her necessities. All the night she never ceased her crying, mixing her lament with words of some unintelligible jargon. And when the doctor arrived, he pronounced her insane. She lay on her bed for a week, now wailing, as people said, like one lost and damned for eternity, and now sunk in a heavy coma. It was thought that grief at the loss of her husband had unsettled her mind, and the medical man did not at one time expect her to live. I need not say that I was deeply interested in this story, and I made my friend write to me at intervals with all the particulars of the case. I heard then that in the course of 6 weeks the woman gradually recovered the use of her faculties, and some months later she gave birth to a son christened Gervase, who unhappily proved to be of weak intellect. Such were the facts known to the village. But to me, while I whitened at the suggested thought of the hideous enormities that had doubtless been committed, all this was nothing short of conviction, and I incautiously hazarded a hint of something like the truth to some scientific friends. The moment the words had left my lips, I bitterly regretted having spoken, and thus given away the great secret of my life. But with a good deal of relief mixed with indignation, I found my fears altogether misplaced, for my friends ridiculed me to my face, and I was regarded as a madman, and beneath a natural anger I chuckled to myself, feeling as secure amidst these blockheads as if I had confided what I knew to the desert sands. But now, knowing so much, I resolved I would know all, and I concentrated my efforts on the task of deciphering the inscription on the Black Seal. For many years I made this puzzle the sole object of my leisure moments, for the greater portion of my time was of course devoted to other duties, and it was only now and then that I could snatch a week of clear research. If I were to tell the full history of this curious investigation, this statement would be wearisome to the extreme, for it would contain simply the account of long and tedious failure. But what I knew already of ancient scripts, I was well equipped for the chase, as I always termed it to myself. I had correspondents amongst all the scientific men in Europe, and indeed in the world, and I could not believe that in these days any character, however ancient and however perplexed, could long resist the searchlight I should bring to bear upon it. Yet, in point of fact, it was fully 14 years before I succeeded. With every year my professional duties increased, and my leisure became smaller. This no doubt retarded me a good deal, and yet when I look back on those years I am astonished at the vast scope of my investigation of the Black Seal. I made my bureau a centre, and from all the world and from all the ages I gathered transcripts of ancient writing. Nothing, I resolved, should pass me unawares, and the faintest hint should be welcomed and followed up. But as one covert after another was tried and proved empty of result, I began in the course of years to despair, and to wonder whether the Black Seal were the sole relic of some race that had vanished from the world and left no other trace of its existence, had perished, in fine, as Atlantis is said to have done, in some great cataclysm, its secrets perhaps drowned beneath the ocean or moulded into the hearts of the hills. The thought chilled my warmth a little, and though I still persevered, it was no longer with the same certainty of faith. A chance came to the rescue. I was staying in a considerable town in the north of England, and took the opportunity of going over the very creditable museum that had for some time been established in the place. The curator was one of my correspondents, and as we were looking through one of the mineral cases, my attention was struck by a specimen, a piece of black stone some 4 inches square, the appearance of which reminded me in a measure of the Black Seal. I took it up carelessly, and was turning it over in my hand, when I saw to my astonishment that the underside was inscribed. I said quietly enough to my friend the curator that the specimen interested me, and that I should be much obliged if he would allow me to take it with me to my hotel for a couple of days. He, of course, made no objection, and I hurried to my rooms, and found that my first glance had not deceived me. There were 2 inscriptions, one in the regular cuneiform character, another in the character of the Black Seal, and I realized that my task was accomplished. I made an exact copy of the 2 inscriptions, and when I got to my London study and had the seal before me, I was able seriously to grapple with the great problem. The interpreting inscription on the museum specimen, though in itself curious enough, did not bear on my quest, but the transliteration made me master of the secret of the Black Seal. Conjecture, of course, had to enter into my calculations. There was here and there uncertainty about a particular ideograph, and one sign recurring again and again on the seal baffled me for many successive nights. But at last the secret stood open before me in plain English, and I read the key of the awful transmutation of the hills. The last word was hardly written when, with fingers all trembling and unsteady, I tore the scrap of paper into the minutest fragments, and saw them flame and blacken in the red hollow of the fire, and then I crushed the grey films that remained into finest powder. Never since then have I written those words, never will I write the phrases which tell how man can be reduced to the slime from which he came, and be forced to put on the flesh of the reptile and the snake. There was now but one thing remaining. I knew, but I desired to see, and I was after some time able to take a house in the neighbourhood of the Grey Hills, and not far from the cottage where Mrs. Cradock and her son Gervase resided. I need not go into a full and detailed account of the apparently inexplicable events which have occurred here, where I am writing this. I knew that I should find in Gervase Cradock something of the blood of the little people. I found later that he had more than once encountered his kinsmen in lonely places in that lonely land. When I was summoned one day to the garden, and found him in a seizure, speaking or hissing the ghastly jargon of the Black Seal, I am afraid that exultation prevailed over pity. I heard bursting from his lips the secrets of the underworld, and the word of dread, Ishakshar, signification of which I must be excused from giving. But there is one incident I cannot pass over unnoticed. In the waste hollow of the night I awoke at the sound of those hissing syllables I knew so well, and on going to the wretched boy's room, I found him convulsed and foaming at the mouth, struggling on the bed as if he strove to escape the grasp of writhing demons. I took him down to my room and lit the lamp while he lay twisting on the floor, calling on the power within his flesh to leave him. I saw his body swell and become distended as a bladder, while the face blackened before my eyes. And then, at the crisis, I did what was necessary according to the directions on the seal, and putting all scruple on one side, I became a man of science, observant of what was passing. Yet the sight I had to witness was horrible, almost beyond the power of human conception, and the most fearful fantasy. Something pushed out from the body there on the floor, and stretched forth a slimy, wavering tentacle across the room, grasped the bust upon the cupboard, and laid it down on my desk. When it was over, and I was left to walk up and down all the rest of the night, white and shuddering, with sweat pouring from my flesh, I vainly tried to reason within myself. I said truly enough that I had seen nothing really supernatural, that a snail pushing out his horns and drawing them in was but an instance on a smaller scale of what I had witnessed, and yet horror broke through all such reasonings, and left me shattered and loathing myself for the share I had taken in the night's work. There is little more to be said. I am going now to the final trial and encounter, for I have determined that there shall be nothing wanting, and I shall meet the little people face to face. I shall have the Black Seal and the knowledge of its secrets to help me, and if I unhappily do not return from my journey, there is no need to conjure up here a picture of the awfulness of my fate. Pausing a little at the end of Professor Gregg's statement, Miss Lally continued her tale in the following words. Such was the almost incredible story that the professor had left behind him. When I had finished reading it, it was late at night, but the next morning I took Morgan with me, and we proceeded to search the Grey Hills for some trace of the lost professor. I will not weary you with a description of the savage desolation of that tract of country, a tract of utterest loneliness, of bare green hills, dotted over with grey limestone boulders, worn by the ravages of time into fantastic semblances of men and beasts. Finally, after many hours of weary searching, we found what I told you, the watch and chain and purse and the ring, wrapped in a piece of coarse parchment. When Morgan cut the gut that bound the parcel together, and I saw the professor's property, I burst into tears, but the sight of the dreaded characters of the Black Seal repeated on the parchment froze me to silent horror, and I think I understood for the first time the awful fate that had come upon my late employer. I have only to add that Professor Gregg's lawyer treated my account of what had happened as a fairy tale, and refused even to glance at the documents I laid before him. It was he who was responsible for the statement that appeared in the public press, to the effect that Professor Gregg had been drowned, and that his body must have been swept into the open sea. Miss Lally stopped speaking and looked at Mr Phillips with a glance of some inquiry. He, for his part, was sunken in a deep reverie of thought, and when he looked up and saw the bustle of the evening gathering in the square, men and women hurrying to partake of dinner, and crowds already besetting the music halls, all the hum and press of actual life seemed unreal and visionary, a dream in the morning after an awakening. "I thank you," he said at last, "for your most interesting story, interesting to me because I feel fully convinced of its exact truth." "Sir," said the lady, with some energy of indignation, "you grieve and offend me. Do you think I should waste my time and yours by concocting fictions on a bench in Leicester Square?" "Pardon me, Miss Lally, you have a little misunderstood me. Before you began, I knew that whatever you told would be told in good faith, but your experiences have a far higher value than that of bona fides. The most extraordinary circumstances in your account are in perfect harmony with the very latest scientific theories. Professor Lodge would, I am sure, value a communication from you extremely. I was charmed from the first by his daring hypothesis and explanation of the wonders of spiritualism, so called, but your narrative puts the whole matter out of the range of mere hypothesis." "Alas, sir, all this will not help me. You forget I have lost my brother under the most startling and dreadful circumstances. Again I ask you, did you not see him as you came here? His black whiskers, his spectacles, his timid glance to right and left. Think, do not these particulars recall his face to your memory?" "I am sorry to say I have never seen any one of the kind," said Phillips, who had forgotten all about the missing brother. "But let me ask you a few questions. Did you not notice whether Professor Gregg—" "Pardon me, sir, I have stayed too long. My employers will be expecting me. I thank you for your sympathy. Goodbye." Before Mr Phillips had recovered from his amazement at this abrupt departure, Miss Lally had disappeared from his gaze, passing into the crowd that now thronged the approaches to the Empire. He walked home in a pensive frame of mind, and drank too much tea. At 10 o'clock he had made his third brew, and had sketched out the outlines of a little work to be called Protoplasmic Reversion. End of Novel of the Black Seal.